Hi, how you doing? I thought it might be interesting to make a few videos defining some of the things that I talk about a lot and kind of assume that you already know. So this video, as the title would suggest, is going to look at what actually classical pugilism is. In the simplest possible terms, classical pugilism refers to boxing that predates the Marquis of Queensberry's rules. As a term, it was effectively created by Kirk Lawson, who's a HEMA instructor and researcher who's done a phenomenal amount of work looking at early pugilism and categorizing it and codifying it. We all owe a great amount to Kirk. And if you go to lulu.com, you can get hold of his fantastic book, Banned from Boxing, which effectively looks at the grappling arts of classical pugilism. And that's kind of Kirk's speciality. So classical pugilism as an art is effectively defined by the absence of gloves during competitions. You'll find that we can split it into three separate eras, and those eras are all distinct from each other. The early era, which starts in antiquity and finishes with the introduction of Broughton's rules in 1743, was relatively chaotic, and there was no agreed rule set, which basically meant that fighters agreed before the fight what the rules were going to be, and then fought to those rules. In practice, what this meant was that pretty much anything goes. So punching was fine, elbows were fine, knees were fine, kicking was fine, grappling and throwing was fine, ground fighting was fine, stamping on your opponent while they were on the floor, absolutely fine, picking them up, throwing them off the stage into the crowd, absolutely fine. These things were all considered perfectly acceptable in the early era. Obviously, over time, what tended to happen is that things became acceptable or not acceptable, even though they weren't technically against the rules. And towards the end of the early era, we've got an almost agreed set of rules. But one of the most important things within the early era is the fact that we had our first ever champion. James Figg was the first person to become acclaimed as champion of all England in 1719. So some 24 years before the introduction of the first rule set. And one of his students, Jack Broughton, who fought initially in the early era to no agreed rule set, killed a man during a bout and was so upset and overcome with remorse that he used his influence and ability to create a rule set to try and make sure that nobody ever died in the ring again. Sadly, that didn't happen, but it did make boxing an awful lot safer. So in 1743, Jack Broughton introduced the first set of agreed rules. And that it starts the second era of classical pugilism, the Broughton's Rules era. This lasted for almost 100 years, and during this era, taking hold of your opponent below the waist was considered illegal. Striking an opponent who was down was considered illegal. And the other thing that Broughton introduced that had never really been part of boxing was the concept of rounds. Now, they were done in a very different way. A round took as long as it took. There was no time limit on a round, and a round only finished when one of the fighters touched the ground. So anything from the knees upwards hits the ground, that's the end of the round. And that gives the fighters 30 seconds to recover. If during those 30 seconds a fighter's not able to come back up to a line or a scratch in the ring, then they're considered to have not come up to scratch, and the fight's then over. So fights tended to have a lot of rounds. Some of the rounds could be incredibly long, some of them could be incredibly short. But the fact is, rounds were introduced. The other thing that Broughton introduced during the Broughton's Rules era was the use of large padded gloves during training and non-competition bouts. And these were obviously the precursor to modern boxing gloves. Now, over time, the Broughton's rules era slightly evolved, and the rules became a little bit more restrictive until in 1838 the London prize ring rules were introduced. And that starts the third and last era of classical pugilism, the London prize ring era. Now, in that era, which only lasted some 30 years maybe, the rules were significantly more restrictive. Grappling began to be unacceptable. Throwing your opponent to the ground began to be considered unacceptable, and so on. And very soon afterwards, the Marquis of Queensberry's rules were introduced, which effectively laid the template for modern boxing. Grappling was no longer acceptable. Throwing your opponent was no longer acceptable. Rounds were of a specific length, 3 minutes, and the break between rounds was a specific length, 1 minute. And that effectively created modern boxing. So everything from the Marquis of Queensberry's rules onwards isn't actually classical pugilism. Fights were carried out using gloves to protect the hands and the face from cuts. There's an argument that the use of gloves actually makes the art of boxing more dangerous, but we'll leave that for another video. So that's classical pugilism. It's the art of boxing without gloves as carried out before the introduction of the Marquis of Queensberry's rules, and you can split it into 3 eras. There's a fact sheet on this available through HEMAC, the Historical European Martial Arts Coalition. I'll put a link down in the description. Let me know what you think. Has any of this been new to you? If not, well, good. Good. I'm glad that knowledge about classical pugilism is starting to grow. Anyway, I'll stop talking now, and I'll see you soon. Take care, guys.